Hi, my name's David Baines, and I'm the Lewis and Ann Armstrong Professor of Religion and Interim Chair of the Religion Department in the Howard College of Arts and Sciences here at Samford University. I've been teaching at Samford for about 18 years, and I love the fact that at Samford we have small classes where students and faculty can get to know one another. I first became interested in the study of worship and church architecture, probably because when I was a young child we alternated between two congregations a few blocks from each other. The Episcopal Church, in which my father grew up in, and the Methodist Church, in which my mom had grown up in. I teach Christian worship at Samford, and one of my favorite activities is the day we take students around to visit different worship spaces here in Birmingham and explore how they shape different types of worship in different congregations. It's tempting to talk about reading a church or reading a worship space, but I think it's better to talk about analyzing them and thinking about how worship spaces shape us. Analyzing a worship space means that we're looking at how the spaces shape people in them. The former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards they shape us." So what we're going to be trying to explore is how spaces shape Christians. I can't teach you everything about how to analyze a worship space in one video, but I can give you some pointers that should guide how you look at worship spaces, whether you're seeing them for the first time or the 100th time. The first thing that you want to do is perhaps pretty obvious, to identify the space. And we can think about this as a number of interrelated questions. What was the space built for? Was it built for weekly worship? Is it built to be a college chapel? Is it built to be a prayer chapel in a hospital that is only used occasionally and usually just by individuals? Second, we can think about who is it built for? Is this built for Baptists or Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox, or for someone who thinks of themselves as a non-denominational community? So what was it built for, and who was it built for? Another question to consider is, has the space changed over time? I know of one church in Midtown Atlanta that's a Gothic Revival church, as I'd call it, and it was built in the early 20th century to serve a Methodist congregation. Then later the Methodists moved it and a Pentecostal church met in it. And then later the Pentecostal church sold it and it became a restaurant for nearly 3 decades. And now it is St. Paul's Presbyterian Church. And so the history of this church building is related to the history of the neighborhood and also the history of how the actual worship space inside the building has been reconfigured over time for Methodist worship, Pentecostal worship, dining, and now a Presbyterian service. The second big thing to do after you've identified the space as a whole is to identify the spaces within the space. Where are the different places that people sit or stand and move through the service? And then you need to think about how these spaces are actually used in worship services. Sometimes there's pulpits that were built for an earlier time and era in the history of worship that are rarely used today. Also, there may be a communion table somewhere in a center focus, but toward the back that might only be used a few times a year. Next, you need to think about how these different spaces are related to one another. What is the position of the choir to the congregation? Are they facing the congregation, or are they facing the same direction as the congregation? We want to think about the relationship of different spaces and how people move through this. So once you've identified the space and identified the spaces in it, take a step back and think about the overall mood, or what I might call the aesthetic or artistic impact of the space on you. This is probably best approached by thinking, how does the space make you feel? Does the space impress you as one of grandeur, where it's a space in which you need to be quiet? Does the space seem homey? and accessible, what's the basic way that it makes you feel? For example, if I take students into Hodges Chapel here on campus, most of them see it as a grand space, a space that they're inclined to be quiet in, that they're inclined to behave in a more reserved fashion in, that they're not entirely sure where they should go or where they can't go. Whereas if we go into some more modern churches, they might see them as very familiar and very accessible. The fourth of our 5 big questions to think about is to think about what you would associate the building with. We can talk about this as the style of the building, taking the building and its overall scheme of decoration as a whole. It's really common as I drive around the Southeast to see churches that have spires, something like Samford's Reed Chapel, white spires, maybe more or less elaborate, and often they're sitting on all sorts of different kinds of buildings. And that's because that spire has come to, originally was sort of pointing upward to heaven, but in many ways it's come to function simply as a sign that this is a church. Indeed, usually that this is a Protestant church and often a Baptist church. The last question that you should be asking of our 5 questions is to consider the different works of art that are part of the worship space. Some churches have elaborate collections of artworks, some have just a few, and some have none at all. And often these are very deliberately chosen. So see if you can identify particular artworks in the building and think about how they might be related together into a sequence, or what architectural scholars would call a program. The next thing to think about is, coming back to our theme of spaces that shape, is to think, how do the artworks shape the worship experience? How are people encouraged or invited to interact with the art? The important thing about analyzing a worship space is to know that spaces of worship aren't accidental. They're intentionally designed to encourage certain kinds of activity and to discourage other kinds of activity. They exist in order to shape people's action, their action of worship. The buildings say something about the people who worship in them and the God that they worship. They shape our experiences of worship and God. These are places where people meet God in worship and hopefully leave transformed, leave filled with the gospel to live differently in the world.